I was in the US Army for 10 plus years, here's a story. Edit number 2, I can't thank all of you guys enough. Part 2 is up, happy Veterans Day to all my brothers and sisters in arms, and thanks to everyone else for making us feel like we accomplished something during our service. Edited and resubmitted, sorry for not reading the rules earlier, not too familiar here as it's my first time posting. Throwaway account for several reasons. 1. I know people on Reddit, some of whom are still on the job, and for their protection it would be better if they remained anonymous. 2. OPSEC guys, I will try to be specific, but will be leaving out specific dates and places. 3. I don't want anyone coming after me. Anyway, like the title says, I was in the Army for 10 years. During that time I traveled all over the world for deployments and training ops. I've seen a lot of the bad shit the world has to offer, and a lot of the good. I was an infantryman, and sniper, and during my first deployment to Iraq, I spent a lot of time sitting on rooftops, or inside abandoned buildings. I would watch streets, city blocks, whatever, trying to pin down patterns of life, and get a better idea of what was happening out in sector. Often, my 3-man team would get attached to a line platoon, and go out on a 24 to 48 hour mission to get eyes on an intersection or building where we suspected the enemy moved. 99.9% of the time everything went according to plan. We would either spend all day looking at nothing, we would get compromised at the break of dawn and get into a day-long gunfight, or if we were really lucky, we would get the drop on the bad guys and end up ambushing them. A couple times though, things would happen that really defied logic or expectation. Now, understand that throughout this whole period of my life I was almost always sleep deprived, hungry, and under extreme levels of stress. I don't discount the idea that at least some of what I experienced was due to the above factors playing tricks on my mind or whatever. Oh, also I've had one of 2 paranormal experiences from before the Army, don't know if that has anything to do with anything, but worth mentioning. Baghdad, we were on a foot patrol to check out a part of our sector we rarely went to, not for any specific reason. The bad guys never went there, so we never went there. The whole area, about 3 city blocks, had been a Christian neighborhood before the fall of Saddam, but after law and order broke down completely, the Christians were either forced out or murdered. We were just going from building to building at night checking things out. We found this one house with a room on the roof that had been built separately from the main structure, which in and of itself was pretty common. What was strange was that this room had a door that was locked from the inside. It was a sheet metal door with a hand latch on the inside which you could lock with a padlock. For some reason this intrigued me and I had an urge to find out what was in there. So we proceed to go to town on this door with our breaching kit. It took about 20 minutes of solid work before we yanked this fucking door open. First off, at this point I'm a seasoned combat soldier, seen some shit, did some shit, not easily spooked. This room scared the fuck out of me as soon as we opened the door. There was a single hallway leading back to a T intersection. It was pitch black and the smell wafting out of there was like a butcher shop. Blood, raw meat etc. My hackles are up at attention at this point. We enter slowly and spread out to check the structure. There were several rooms, all with dried blood covering the floor, smears on the walls. It was evident some horrific shit happened in here. The last room contained an old metal bed frame, with leather restraints, and wires running off to the opposite corner where a car battery sat. Also there was an oppressive heaviness in the whole place, like the air had weight. We got the fuck out of there as quickly as we could. The strangest part was that it was locked with a padlock, and dead bolted from the inside, but there was absolutely no other way out beside the door. No windows, one door, locked from the inside. We never figured that one out, but I still think about it all the time. That same night we found another house locked from the inside, bullet holes all over the walls and "Please God help us" written over and over on the wall in Arabic. The words were written in red ink, and I swear to God, one of the words was dripping wet red down the wall. Our interpreter said it was a bad place and we noped the fuck back to the cop as quickly as possible. Anyway, Therese, more strange shit I've seen, but I'm on mobile and this is an ass pain to type up. If Therese any interest, I'll share more from Afghanistan, and other parts. I was in the US Army for 10 plus years, here's a story, part 2. First, let me say thank you again to everyone who contributed to yesterday's thread. The stories all you guys shared were far better than mine, and shed some much needed light on some of the topics I discussed, so thanks. I decided to start a part 2 since I managed to get in touch with some of my buddies and pry some spooky stuff out of them. To a man, they all explained away their experiences as some sort of natural phenomenon, or lack of sleep, stress etc. That doesn't change the fact that lots of guys I know experienced things they couldn't explain at one time or another. Around the fall of 2008, we were back from Iraq and trying to settle back into the garrison mindset, dial things back a notch as it were. Everyone was waiting to go on block leave for 30 days, and come back ready for round 2. It was during that time, I got promoted to sergeant and put in charge of my first fire team. Part of every new NCO's duties is to provide the beer for a platoon Weidenkopt, or non-commissioned officer professional development class. Basically an excuse for all the sergeants to get blasted together and swap stories, share advice etc. One of the senior guys in my company had been in the army for quite a while. He had been to Somalia for Black Hawk Down, Kosovo, Bosnia, and Desert Storm before Oif and Oaf. He told me about waiting on the Saudi side of the berm waiting to go into Iraq, stealth fighters and bombers flying by overhead to knock out Iraqi army positions, the roar of paladins loosing their missiles against unsuspecting armor and infantry miles away. They waited in that desert for 6 months before finally crossing into Kuwait. By the time they got there the war was pretty much over. He was with an armored cavalry unit, and saw some limited action mainly against poorly trained and equipped conscript units in ancient Soviet tanks. The American war machine swept over those poorly defended positions easily, and within 72 hours the ground war was over. Now I know everyone has seen Jarhead and seen the news footage of the Highway of Death. My buddy wasn't involved in that part of the ground action. His unit was part of the Anvil the retreating Iraqis hit during their flight from Kuwait. After everything was said and done, they still spent the next few months on the ground basically cleaning everything up. He told me stories about clearing Iraqi bunkers and trench complexes, sifting through the remains of entire companies wiped out in bombing or whatever. Up to this point, what he described was pretty typical of a major ground action, but I still can't imagine finding myself in the position of being in a major conventional war. He went on to describe one day in particular, toward the end of his time on the ground. They woke up from their hastily dug fighting positions in the middle of the desert, wiped the grime out of their eyes, ate a quick MRE, and trucked to a destroyed Iraqi radar site. His platoon was tasked with collecting any intelligence they might find, and collecting dog tags off of the corpses that littered what seemed like the entire Kuwaiti desert. They still had to be careful. A handful of guys had already been killed by booby traps that the Iraqis strung up before retreating. They arrived on site and started their sweep. There were dozens of charred corpses scattered around outside. The site was a relatively deep and well-constructed bunker that contained the CP and a trench line about 100 meters long. Strewn about were pictures of wives and kids, personal effects, letters, books. Anything that hadn't been destroyed in the bombing was collected by the troops as war trophies, or brought back to S2 for analysis. He found himself alone, down in the bunker. It was a rectangular concrete box, with a machine gun slit in the front, think Saving Private Ryan. The roof was half collapsed, with a large hole punched through it where a bunker buster had burrowed down and incinerated the occupants. There was a dead Iraqi slumped across a DSSHK machine gun, the Soviet version of out .50 California. He said even then, he got a really creepy vibe down there. Aside from the dead machine gunner, there were the remains of at least 3 others in there, but they were closer to being completely atomized. They must have been directly under the bomb when it fell. My buddy quickly snatched the machine gunner's dog tags off his neck, stuffed them in his pocket, and left back to the surface. Later on, the platoon was gathered together eating lunch in the scorched sand. He described it like Jarhead, where every time he took a step it left a footprint of white sand in the blackened top layer. Anyway, the guys were comparing stories about what they had seen, and what trophies they had collected. They got down to the dog tags they had, and started comparing the number they had managed to collect. Some guys had a pile of tags, others only had a few. My buddy had the one set he found on the machine gunner. He went on to tell some friends about how creepy it had been in the bunker and how he felt kinda bad for that gunner, manning his position to the last, maybe covering his buddy's retreat in the face of the Americans. One of his friends asked what machine gunner? He had been down in the bunker and hadn't seen any bodies down there. Thinking his friend was mistaken, maybe there was a different bunker he hadn't seen, He went back after lunch to make sure. He stepped down into the bunker, and sure enough, there was the DSSHK, with no gunner. He said at this point his hair was standing on end. He was sure the dead guy had been there. That's when he noticed the drag marks through the charred topsoil. They led across the floor and up the steps to the surface. He followed them out away from the fighting position, about 50 meters. Lying in the sand was the gunner. His body was frozen in a low crawl position, left leg straight back, right knee cocked up, left arm reaching forward and raised off the ground as if reaching for something, maybe a way home. He assumed one of the sick fuckers in his platoon had moved the body, but when he asked, no one fessed up. On the drive back, he realized the machine gunner had been facing towards the Iraqi border.